Hey everybody, and welcome to my channel. My name is Rachel, and it's been a while since I've made a video, and I'm trying today just to kind of get myself back into the habit of making videos. And I also have to kind of just work on getting my workflow going again, because I actually purchased some new equipment, some better equipment for making videos, and while that should have helped me, it actually kind of just set me back, just because it's a completely different workflow than what I'm used to. So today I'm going to be doing kind of just an easy video, and I'm going to be filling this new palette with gouache, and then I am going to be testing this gouache in this sketchbook. This is a Cottonwood Arts recycled notebook. It has toned paper, and I really want to just be able to try this out and start doing some more sketches. And I really would like to get into gouache a little bit. I've tried it before, so I'm not totally new to gouache, and I really like the medium because I actually do both watercolor paintings and oil paintings. And the cool thing about gouache is that it's sort of a very unique medium in the sense that it's opaque, like oils tend to be, but then it's also water-based. So I think it's a really great tool to do color studies with, especially before taking on a big oil painting project. And it's a fun way to experiment too. And it's easy to clean up, just like watercolor. That's one thing I really love about watercolor, and why maybe I tend to do watercolor a little bit more, just because when time is limited, cleanup can be a big hindrance to oil painting. So it's easier for me to sit down and do some watercolor painting or some gouache painting when I get home from work in the evening and I don't have much time and I've got lots of other things that I have to do. So it's just a little bit more accessible. So I want to go ahead and fill up this palette, and then we're going to test this out. Now, most of these are Graham brand, and I'll go through all the colors as I'm filling my palette up. Now, I've had experience with gouache with both of these brands, and I personally really prefer Graham for gouache paint because it stays very malleable, it's easy to reactivate, and I find that Winsor and Newton becomes a little bit more brittle and hard, and it takes longer to reactivate, it kind of cracks a little bit. So the only reason I actually have any Winsor and Newton gouache colors is just because they actually offer a better spectrum of color than Graham, unfortunately. So I hope that Graham comes up, especially with the more vibrant, vivid colors. For example, I'm going to be using Cobalt Turquoise Light from Winsor & Newton, and then also Opera Rose. These are really bright, vivid colors, and unfortunately, Graham just doesn't offer these. I have a couple of other Winsor & Newton tubes in here. These are all Winsor & Newton. These are the gouaches that I tried initially. So I have kind of a brand preference, I guess, for Winsor & Newton just because I'm so familiar with them. So the first set of gouache paint that I bought was this Winsor & Newton basic set, and I do want to use them up because I hate wasting anything. The thing is that when I squeeze these out, I really kind of have to use them up in one sitting, which is really kind of difficult to do, and I hate wasting so much, so it's hard for me to wash away unused paint, and then I'll just let it sit there and it'll get really dry, and then it's almost unusable after it dries up. But for a couple of colors, I'm willing to just kind of take that on. So the other two colors that I have from Winsor & Newton that I won't be putting in this palette because they're actually quite similar to some of these colors, I have Brilliant Violet. So instead of Brilliant Violet, I have this Quinacridone Violet from Graham that I'll be using, so it's similar enough. And then I also have Opera Pink. So I bought both Opera Rose and Opera Pink. Don't think I did that on purpose, and actually, no, I'll stick with that. But I mean, these two I think could almost be interchangeable. There's not a huge difference between them. So I'm going to go ahead and have the Opera Rose in this palette. This is just a plastic palette. I actually bought this at Hobby Lobby, which I rarely buy anything at Hobby Lobby, but I think this was like 50% off. You know how they have that great sale going on sometimes. So I kind of bought this on impulse. Thought it would be great for gouache. I like these cups because they're pretty deep. They also come out so I can wash them easily if I ever need to. And they have lids, and I think that that is really important for gouache. Okay, so I've got 12 little compartments here on this palette, but I actually have 14 tubes laid out here. And that's because I'm actually not going to fill a compartment with either titanium white or ivory black. So when I want to use these, I'm just going to squeeze them out into the palette. Especially with titanium white, it's one of those things where, you know, kind of like yellow, it gets contaminated really easily anyway. So you may as well just squeeze out what you need and squeeze out a small amount each time you are actually going to paint. And then ivory black is just not something I probably will use a whole lot unless I'm doing a value study, but I don't really use black very often when I'm painting. So I'm actually going to leave those out, and I have these divided a little bit. So I have kind of my primary colors here, and then I have my vivid colors in the middle, and then I have some earth tones over here. And I'm actually really excited about using earth tones more. That's not something I've really personally used a whole lot of. I tend to stick with the primary colors, whether I'm painting in watercolor or oil or gouache, because I'm just used to mixing everything. But I do kind of want to start using more of these earthy pigments in my work. So let's start out with my primaries, and the first primary that I'm going to be using is Azo Yellow by M. Graham. These wells are really deep, so I probably could just about empty a whole tube. And I don't think I will, though. I'm not going to just completely fill up each compartment. And then, to kind of get it down in there a little more evenly, I'm going to be using toothpicks just to kind of stir it up, get it leveled a little bit. Alright, and then, because I don't want to waste toothpicks, I am just going to kind of, well, gosh, I really don't like wasting. So let's try to scrape off as much of that as I can. Okay, and then I'm just going to kind of wipe this off onto a paper towel as we go. I have a couple of toothpicks, but I don't know. I just don't like wasting anything. And I know if it's sitting up there, it's not going to get used as easily, but all right, let's cool it with the perfectionism. Constant reminder. It's another thing that makes it difficult to make videos, especially with new equipment, is just that kind of bit of perfectionism that comes naturally to so many of us. It's difficult when you have kind of a routine or a way of working and you want to make it better, but then the process of improvement becomes a hang-up in and of itself. Oh, I'm sorry. This is M. Graham. This is called Naphthal Red, or maybe it's Naphthal. N-A-P-H-T-H-O-L. Why do pigments have to be so difficult to pronounce? Let's go with Naphthal Red. And this is a nice red because it's very similar to like a cadmium red medium, which cadmiums are both expensive and toxic. So anytime I find a good substitute pigment for something that is either expensive or toxic, I try to go for that, although especially in oil painting, like if I'm doing a finished oil painting, I don't really mind using cadmiums or, you know, even lead white. I just take extra precaution. But when I just want to sketch and have fun, I don't want to have to worry about toxins. Here we have Cobalt Blue by M. Graham. Nice primary blue. Usually when you buy a primary set, and this did come as a set from M. Graham, usually they give you like an ultramarine blue. But I'm glad that that M. Graham in their primary set, they give you something a little bit different. And I do find that this is more neutral in terms of its temperature, meaning it's not a warm blue, it's not really a cool blue. To me, it really does kind of seem more like a true blue. It's very thick. I even got a new microphone, so I'm really hoping that that is nice. One of the biggest feedback comments that I get, especially on my Skillshare courses, is that the audio is not great. And I've tried out lots and lots of different microphones, and they all have problems, in my opinion. And so I'm curious to see what this one is going to sound like. Okay, so here's Graham Viridian. This is a color that often comes in primary sets, whether it's watercolor or oil or gouache, and this came in the primary set from Graham. And I've found it challenging to use, but I'm finally kind of getting the hang of it, because Viridian, it's such an unnatural green, and I'm so used to mixing greens that I just always wondered why this particular green was included in so many different primary sets. And I think I finally figured it out, because you know that beautiful like crystal turquoise color of tropical waters, like in the Caribbean or, you know, anywhere that's just beautiful? That turquoise is so difficult to mix if you don't have a green like this. So this green plus some blue is going to give you the most beautiful turquoise color. And turquoise, teal, you know, whatever you want to call it. I'm not really a big like color name person. I get them wrong all the time. I don't really concern myself with the names of particular colors or all those nuances. But, you know, that's kind of one of my favorite colors, that kind of turquoise or teal or aqua. Speaking of which, this is Winsor & Newton, and this is that Cobalt Turquoise Light. Now, Cobalt is also toxic. And so you gotta be careful using it, because these toxins, they absorb into your skin. So really, best practice would be to wear gloves anytime that you're painting with any toxic pigment. You're not going to have to worry about breathing it in because it's not airborne, but it's just something to be aware of. But this is a really beautiful color. And as I was just saying, it's one of my favorite colors. So even though I know I can kind of mix something close, I still buy it just because it's so pretty. All right. Let's wipe this off. And I'm going to do swatches of all of these colors, even though I probably should let it dry before I do that. I'm not going to. So let's see. So I'm going to have to kind of split my vivid colors between this row and this row, just because of how the palette is divided, and that bugs the perfectionist in me, but we're just going to go with it. All right, so I think, what should I do? I think I'm going to actually put the Opera Pink up here, and then the Quinacridone Violet will go down here with the neutrals, and that's how we'll split this up. So again, and also these two are both Winsor & Newton, so that'll kind of help me keep that straight, just because I know that these are going to take a little bit longer to reactivate, and they're not going to be as malleable as the Graham colors, which everything else is going to be Graham. The other thing to know about these particular pigments, especially Opera Rose or the Opera Pink that I have set aside, these are not very light, fast pigments. So ideally, in using these, what I would do is, first of all, there's ways to kind of varnish and finish off your gouache painting to help protect them a little bit, but I mostly see myself using the Opera Pink in instances where I want to make prints, because if I scan the painting after it's dried and then make prints, like giclée prints, then that color will last within the print, even though within the painting itself, it isn't as permanent. It's going to fade over time, especially if it's exposed to UV light. But if this color is replicated onto a print, then we won't have that issue. So that's the reason why I still will buy a color like this, even though I know that it's not light fast. Like if I sold the original painting and it was hung up in a way that it was exposed to a lot of UV light, this color would fade, and relatively fast too, not over like years, but literally over months, unfortunately. So I probably would avoid using a color like that in any painting where I'm wanting to sell the original. But in a sketchbook where the sketchbook will be closed and it's not going to be exposed to light, that color is going to last a lot longer. And if I make prints from that sketch, this color in that print is still going to be beautiful over a long period of time. All right, so now we're going to move on to the bottom row, and I'm going to be putting in the Graham Quinacridone Violet down here. I'm excited to use this color because this is probably the only color that I have not used ever at all in any medium. Like I said, until pretty recently, I've been pretty conservative in the pigments that I buy. I kind of buy the basics over and over again. And just recently I've wanted to branch out a little bit more and try some different pigments. One good way for me to not feel like I'm wasting paint when I kind of rub this off on the side is when I'm doing my little swatches, I'm going to get the pigment from these little drips right here, so I won't feel so much like I'm being wasteful. Okay, so now I'm going to do Payne's Gray, one of my favorite colors. No matter what medium I'm using, I love Payne's Gray. It's just so beautiful and subtle, and I probably am going to need to buy a big tube of this. And I'm noticing too, as I kind of mix these up with the toothpick, some of these pigments are much, much thicker than others, which is kind of interesting. I expect that more with oil paint, to have kind of that difference in viscosity or texture. With watercolor, I don't really ever notice that. It seems pretty consistent no matter which pigment I'm using. But with oil, and apparently probably less so with gouache than with oil, but there's just a little bit different viscosity from pigment to pigment. All right, so next, I think I'll go ahead and do the yellow ochre. So these are getting into my more earthy colors. And I'm looking forward to using a lot of earthy colors, like experimenting with portraits and figure painting. And just kind of exploring the subtleties and really working with skin tones. And for myself personally, I'm really wanting to get better, especially at portraits. It's so intimidating. And sometimes I get lucky with portraits, and sometimes I get lucky with multiple portraits, and then I think I've got it, and then all of a sudden I realize there's so much that I haven't committed to both my mental memory and also my muscle memory in terms of doing portraits accurately. All right, so that was my Graham Yellow Ochre. This is going to be Graham Raw Sienna. This is a brand new tube, I just got it. I just bought a lot of earth tones for my oil painting collection too. And the thing about any kind of earthy color, any pigment that's made from an easily sourced natural material, so siennas, umbers, you know, ochres, things like that, these are really inexpensive. So I actually have started investing in really, really high-end oil paints. And I try to stick with these earthy colors because it just makes it more affordable to be able to buy those really high-end paints. And I think that that's pretty exciting because I can keep my costs down while also having the kind of top of the line materials. All right, so next is Graham Burnt Sienna. This is kind of a reddish, earthy brown color. Also a brand new tube. Trying to reuse these toothpicks in a way that makes sense. So kind of use the red end of this toothpick. I don't know why I think it's so important to keep these colors from intermixing, because ultimately when I'm painting there's a lot of cross-contamination, and that doesn't really bother me too much except when it comes to like yellows and whites, and you know, that's just part of painting. All right, so the last one is going to be Raw Umber, Graham, and then we're going to do some swatches. And this is kind of a, I don't even know how to describe this in terms of its temperature, but it's very earthy. I would almost say that it's kind of a cool earthy color because it's more neutral than, say, burnt umber. Burnt umber would be more warm, and raw umber tends to be a little bit more cool. One of my favorite ways, if I'm going to mix up my own black, I will use raw umber and a little bit of blue. The blue helps just to cool it down a little bit to really turn it into a nice black, and I think I'll try to show that to you in the sketchbook too. Hopefully I don't forget. Kind of winging this. Okay, so we have everything filled up. Now let's do some swatches. Guess I'll go ahead and put these all away. And I keep both watercolors and gouache tubes in these. These are actually just food containers, and they have lids that seal them up because you really want to keep your watercolors and your gouache paints as, you know, free of drying out as possible. So putting them in kind of an airtight container is going to help them last longer, because even inside the tube they can dry up a little bit. I better get a little bit of white and black squeezed out. There's some crumbs of blue in there for some reason. Let's see. I guess I'll put white up here. Oops. Oh my. Okay. Well, I guess it's going down there. So I will, instead of putting my black up here because it's just going to slide down into the white, I'll put my black over here so it can just be down here in this corner. Lessons learned. Okay. And I don't need much black, I do not think. So that should do it. That was probably too much, actually. But anyway, yeah, keep your tubes in a container that you can kind of seal up and it won't be exposed to too much oxygen, because these pigments can actually dry up inside the tube. So don't just leave them out. Where's the lid? So this lid seals it really tight and keeps air out and will help preserve these tubes over a longer period of time. All right, get my water and a napkin here. If you want to buy sketchbooks from Cottonwood Arts, go directly to their website. I think sometimes they do have these available on sites like Amazon, but I think it's better just to buy it from them directly. And every single month they have a sale where they'll pick a category of of all their sketchbooks and papers, and they'll do like a 30% off for the entire month. And so I've actually bought a whole bunch of these because they were on sale for 30% off one month. And so you just are going to get better deals if you go directly to the website. These are really great books. I have used them before. The paper is really nice and thick, so it takes gouache really well. Let's see, what is the actual thickness of these pages? So heavyweight multimedia recycled paper bound in a spiral ring, acid-free, neutral pH, ideal for wet and dry media. But I don't actually see the paper weight on here. I would estimate that it's probably 100 pounds. So it's not as thick as like a 140-pound sheet of watercolor paper. It's very smooth, so it's like a hot press. It's not textured, which means that it's great for ink too. That's one thing about watercolor paper, is that it doesn't always work really great for doing ink because it's so textured, unless you get the hot press stuff. Okay, so what I like to do when I'm doing swatches is I'll actually draw the palette, and then I will just kind of fill everything out so it matches the palette, and it doesn't have to be exact. I like to keep these kind of loose and sketchy anyway. So my circles will be all different sizes. Don't have to be perfect circles. And this is also kind of a fun activity, just if you're like me and you find yourself getting caught in that cycle of perfectionism. This is a great way to break free of that. Just do something where it doesn't need to be perfect and there's no expectation of it being perfect. And you can just have fun and kind of be more carefree. And it is something that really helps me too if I'm in a rut and I haven't been painting and I just need to do something to get that painting muscle reactivated. This is just kind of a fun and easy exercise to help get me back on track when I need that. And we all need that sometimes. All right. And then I'll just use a single brush for this. And so with gouache, unlike watercolor, we don't need to use as much water, so I'm going to just dampen my brush a little bit. And then, as I said before, I'm going to try to just kind of take some of this pigment off the sides where I scraped off the toothpick, so I feel like I'm not wasting that. And then you can see that with gouache, unlike watercolor, if you don't add a lot of water, it's very opaque, which is really, really nice. It would be interesting, and I might try it just to kind of test out what watercolor looks like on a paper like this. And that could be kind of a fun experiment. The thing is that because it is more transparent and you tend to thin it down more, and this is kind of a hot press paper, it's not very absorbent. And I don't know, it may not work super well, but I still think it would be kind of fun to just experiment with that, just to see. So this is the Naphthal Red, very, very opaque. Cobalt Blue. I've found that even the Graham brand of Cobalt Blue kind of dries out a little bit more than some of the other pigments for some reason. And I mean, every pigment kind of has a different quality inherent to it. Not all pigments are created equal. Some pigments are naturally more opaque, some pigments are naturally more transparent, things like that. And so no matter what medium you're painting with, you're going to find, even if you're using a single brand of paint, different pigments are going to behave differently. And so this is also just kind of a nice way to get to experiment and get to know your pigments. So this is the Viridian. I can see that it's a lot more transparent than any of these other colors. It's even more transparent than the Azo Yellow. So even though I'm adding more pigment here, I'm not really getting rid of that transparency. So I'm going to go ahead and just let that dry. I might come back and see if I add another layer on top of this once it dries. Maybe I'll get a little bit more opacity. We'll see. Okay, so Cobalt Turquoise. And this being a Winsor & Newton, I know that it will dry out more. And also using gouache that's freshly squeezed out of the tube is going to be a different experience than using it after it's been squeezed out and kind of let rest for a while. So, I mean, definitely within a couple of days, all of this will kind of dry out as much as it's going to be. And then what I'll do to reactivate it is just add a little bit of water to each well. Look how opaque this is, wow. And I think that's kind of a property of the cobalt pigments. Cobalts tend to be a little bit more opaque. Now I've already forgotten, I think this was the Opera Rose, not the Opera Pink. I have a hard time keeping things straight. This is another Winsor & Newton. Look how bright and vivid that is. I love it. And as I said, if this was going to be hung up on a wall, and you can buy glass, protective glass that is UV resistant, that will help if you are using colors that are not very light fast. But ultimately with a color like this, it just isn't ideal to have the actual original painting exposed to much UV light at all. But it's a beautiful color. Not something I would want to miss out on just because it's not light fast. And this is the Quinacridone Violet. Ooh, this is very beautiful. I've never used this before. Actually, you know what? I put this down here with the neutrals just because I ran out of space up here for it, but I actually feel like this is going to be a color I use with the neutrals a lot. I think this will really mix nicely with some of my neutrals. And I'm just now realizing that. It's kind of exciting. All right, next up is the Payne's Gray. An all-time favorite of mine. It looks very black here. And maybe that's just because it's kind of a cool dark neutral and it's mixing with this warm toned paper. Maybe that little bit of warmth is helping to nudge it more toward a true black than if I was painting on a white sheet of paper. Okay, so yellow ochre, this tends to be a very opaque color. Even in watercolor, this tends to be very opaque. Yellow ochre is also kind of a new favorite for me, something I had not used much of for a long time. All right, so now we have Raw Sienna. And the difference between Raw Sienna and yellow ochre is kind of subtle, but you can see that the Raw Sienna is a little bit, leans a little bit closer to red. And this is also a bit transparent. It's not as easy to tell just because it's a warm earthy tone over a warm earthy tone. But I can tell just from my point of view that it's a little bit transparent. All right, so now Raw Sienna, this is going to be Burnt Sienna. So this is the same pigment, Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, same pigments, just prepared differently. And you can guess pretty easily, but Burnt Sienna is prepared with heat, Raw Sienna is not. So just that application of heat pushes this pigment closer to red. And it's also quite transparent. But when I got more viscous paint with less water in it, that did kind of take some of that transparency out. And now we've got, get that pigment out. So the last one in the wells is going to be Raw Umber. This is a color I use a lot in oil painting, especially for doing the underpainting. So it's just kind of a nice earthy brown. And I will show you, I'll swatch my black here and then I'll kind of mix up a black with the Raw Umber and the Cobalt Blue, and we'll see how close we can get to true black. So this is kind of transparent too, but very dark. All right, so let's do a little bit of white. This white needs to be mixed up just a little bit. It seems like it's separated a bit. Nice and opaque. And with white gouache, like if you're using white gouache with your watercolor and you want it to really have good coverage, you can't water it down really at all. Otherwise, it's just going to kind of absorb into the watercolor and it's going to create kind of a chalky look instead of a white look. All right, so let's do a little bit of black. And then I'll set some Payne's gray next to here, just so you can compare it a little bit more easily. And this is kind of transparent too, it's not super opaque, even though I didn't really add any water to this. All right, so let's try to mix up our own black using Raw Umber. And just a little bit. So I'm not picking up much blue, I'm really just dropping Raw Umber into my blue. Not ideal. So now we can compare. This seems a little bit cool because I think I picked up too much Cobalt Blue. Like I said, with the Raw Umber, it's already a fairly cool neutral color, so you don't need to add a lot of blue in there to really neutralize it. Let's just get a little bit more Raw Umber in there and see if we can nudge this more toward a true black. There we go. So that's pretty close, I would say. Anytime that I'm painting and I need black, I mean, I don't really ever buy a tube of black. I actually have several tubes of black just because it tends to come in primary sets that you buy. And I just don't really use them because I like to mix my own. I like to have a little bit of control over the temperature of my blacks. And then just for comparison's sake, let's go ahead and just set some Payne's gray next to these other blacks. And you'll notice too that when gouache dries, it lightens up just a little bit. So this actually looks more black than both of these right now. But once these dry, I think that there won't be such a difference. All right, so got all of our swatches done, and I want to go ahead and just kind of label these. Let's go ahead and cover these up for now. I might actually try to do a little bit of painting, but we'll see. It's rare too that if I'm painting that I'm going to use every single color on my palette, so if I'm not using certain colors, I'll probably just keep them covered up. But one thing I need to get into the habit of or work on a little bit is not always using just primary colors, because in the last couple of days when I'm painting, I noticed that even though I have several colors on my watercolor palette right now, I tend to go for like the basics and just mix everything, which is great, and I'm glad that I have that habit because it makes your life a little bit more affordable if you're an artist to only have to buy a limited number of colors. But I mean, I have other colors and they all have really unique properties and you can't mix everything. So I want to start using some of those other non-primary colors a little bit more too. So one good way for me to do that is maybe just leave my primaries covered and try to rely on what else I have. Looks like I'm missing a couple of lids. Ah, here they are. Messy workstation. I almost wish that my dogs were barking right now just to see if my new microphone cancels them out at all. That's also a big source of frustration with me in making videos is the background barking. I can't stop it, and yes, I can edit it out, but then sometimes I'm editing out key parts of the painting process, or I have to just mute it and it sounds weird, or I have to do voiceovers. But I know that no one wants just abrupt barking all the time or anytime. So I try not to include that. And with 2 Boston Terriers, that is a big challenge. All right, so I have ink. Do I have a pen somewhere? I know I do. I have a pen with no nib. Oh, here's one. Okay. So let's just go ahead and label these up. But this is fun. This is a good way just to kind of, if you've got a bunch of new colors, just draw your palette, put in the colors, and then label them. And then, you know, if you need kind of a guide, especially, you know, I'll probably do this a little bit later with some of my watercolors, because especially with watercolors, you have some pigments where on the palette they're so dark that you almost can't tell at all what color they are. So it's nice to kind of do a little palette swatch like this, and then you just kind of know what result you're going to get from the different pigments you have squeezed out. Not enough ink. And if you're self-conscious about your handwriting, just look at mine. It's not great. This is not my favorite nib either. There we go. Is this Viridian? I'm already forgetting. I think it was. So there's Viridian, and then there's also like phthalo green. I tend to find those colors very similar to each other, and it can be either one that is often included in primary sets. But they have very similar properties. Now let's see if I can spell quinacridone. At least I can pronounce it. Quinacridone. So now you can really see the difference between these, and one thing I really noticed with my raw umber mixed with cobalt blue, it's a little bit chalky. I think that's actually because of the blue. The blue is a little bit more opaque because it's a cobalt pigment, and I think that that just made this look a little bit chalky. So that's good to know, because with oils I would normally mix raw umber with ultramarine blue, so those are both very transparent pigments and it doesn't look chalky at all. But because I don't have an ultramarine blue gouache, I only have cobalt. Now I know that when I mix my raw umber and cobalt blue, I'm really going to get kind of a chalky gray rather than a true black. So again, you know, not all pigments are created equal. Cobalt blue is very different in its properties from ultramarine blue, specifically when it comes to opacity, and that makes a big deal when, you know, you're trying to mix a specific color like black. So this is going to be, we'll just abbreviate these, cobalt blue, CB, plus RU, raw umber. And then this is ivory, oops, black. Alright, so now we've got burnt sienna and raw umber. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and get things cleaned up, and then I'm actually going to sit down and do a little landscape sketch, I think. So I'll be right back. Okay, and I am back. Let's go ahead and do some sketching here. Very exciting. And one thing I realized that I wanted to do was kind of layer on a little bit more Viridian to see if I could get a little bit more opacity. So I'll just do that really quick before we sketch. Because out of all of these, I feel like this one is the most transparent. And I'm just curious to see if we can work around that if we want to. Not that opacity is the end-all be-all. Sometimes you want it and sometimes you don't. So yeah, if I put on another layer, you can definitely see a big difference. Okay, now let's go ahead and limit my palette here a bit. Let's go ahead and do just what I said I was going to do. I'm gonna leave these primaries covered, and we're just gonna use, so I will use this Viridian here. Let's use Payne's Gray and Yellow Ochre. And what else? I need something a little bit red, I think, so we'll use burnt sienna. That'll be my red. And then maybe just for fun, we'll see what happens if I use some of this Quinacridone Violet too. And what I'm going to be painting is, hopefully you can see it, this is just a picture of a duck that I took. And you know, I love birds, I love ducks. There's a bunch of ducks near where I live, so I have so many photos of ducks. And since that Viridian especially needs to dry, I'll just flip this over. Where did my pencil go? Pencil. Where are you hiding? Oh, okay, I'll use a different pencil. That pencil ran away. I like using colored pencils to sketch lately rather than like a graphite pencil. It never shows up through the paint as much as I actually would like it to. I think I went from being a person who I didn't want any of my lines to show through my paintings to now I think that is kind of an endearing quality. And so now, of course, that I want my lines to show up through my paintings, I tend not to get that as much. Oh well. Okay, so let's just go ahead and get started on this duck. So I'm going to give myself a border. I want my format to not be quite so elongated, a little bit closer to a square. And put the head kind of right around this third. I just love the shape of birds. Love drawing them. And I love how on this white duck we get, it might be hard to see here, my ring light keeps reflecting in there, but I like how the green grass is kind of reflecting, it's the reflected light on the form of the bird. And because the bird is white, you really see that, and I think that makes for really fun painting, especially when you're kind of focused more on doing a color study. I'll try to push that as much as I can. Hopefully that beak isn't too big. It looks like it might be a little too long. And then you really, even though it's not sitting, it's standing, you really don't see the legs, so I'm not going to draw that in at all. So now I've got the form of the duck here pretty well. Again, I really, if my lines show through, all the better. So I'm not trying to make them too light. Just going to kind of restate the lines and just kind of re-examine them a little bit, make sure there isn't anything obviously off. Okay, that's good. And then I'm going to limit myself to just 2 brushes, I think. So I'll use a flat, kind of medium brush here. And these brushes, they're just watercolor brushes. These are Jack Richardson travel brushes. I really, really like them. I tend to use these for gouache rather than watercolor. They don't hold as much water as like a synthetic squirrel brush, which is what I tend to use for my watercolors. So these are also synthetic. They just don't hold as much water. And I think that that's kind of ideal for gouache. All right, I'm gonna do the background first. Let's start out with yellow ochre, I think. And also one thing I would like to experiment with doing, especially with this sketchbook, is allowing some of that toned paper just to show through a little bit. So we'll see how that goes. So anywhere that light is kind of hitting, I'm blocking in with this yellow ochre. And I just want to maneuver, even though my brush feels like it's a little bit too big for some areas. I want to kind of stick with this larger brush for as much of the sketch as possible. And then if I need to, I will use this. But I'm going to try to rely on this brush for most of it because I kind of like sketches where, you know, they're not too precise. And it's also another thing I'm trying to just personally work on is loosening up a little bit. And there's just a little spot of light kind of right here that I want to maintain. So now I'll go in with some Viridian for the shadowy areas. And maybe I'll even mix in a little bit of Payne's gray at some point. We'll see. And one nice thing, because I know that this Viridian is a little bit transparent, is I can just go right over that yellow ochre a little bit to get, without mixing the colors on my palette, I can just mix them directly on my piece of paper. Because I know that that Viridian isn't opaque enough to obliterate the yellow ochre. And I'm going to go ahead and let this green come up onto the bottom of the duck too. You can see this area here where I maybe had a little too much water in my brush. It's going to take a little while to dry because, again, this paper is not very absorbent the way that watercolor paper would be. So it'll stay wet maybe a little longer than I would normally want it to, but with every, it's not just about your paints, it's also about your substrate. And so you're just going to learn through experience the nuances of both your painting medium and also your substrate. So I'm trying to kind of scumble this on top of the yellow ochre so that we get some of that yellow ochre showing through. And then I'm sure I'll have to come back on top with more yellow ochre. So now I want to mix in some Payne's gray here just to darken the shadows a little bit, cool them down a bit more. Add just a tiny bit of water in there. Another thing that I think gouache is really great for is plein air painting. Watercolor is great for plein air painting. Oil I really have a hard time with. I've done it lots and lots of times. The cleanup aspect is just frustrating, and for me it never fails. Like, I go out to do plein air painting and I'm doing the painting, I'm out there way longer than I anticipated that I would need to be out there, and then all of a sudden I like have to go to the bathroom or something, and when you have a bunch of oil painting stuff out, you have to clean it all up because you don't want to make a mess like in your car, or, you know, sometimes I ride my bike and so I can't just have stuff all over the place. That's probably TMI for y'all, but you know, it's true. That's like one of the factors that I think people never talk about when it comes to plein air painting. Like, it's great to plein air paint, but some of us, you know, I don't know, if I have to go, I have to go, and it becomes a huge problem, and it makes it so that I don't ever want to go plein air painting. But if I have a medium that cleans up fairly easily, it just makes it so much more feasible for me to be able to actually go out and do that. So I wish more people would actually talk about that. And I guess that's why I'm going to talk about it here right now, whether you like it or not. Gosh, that almost seems too dark, but let's, you know, kind of leave it for now, not mess with it too much. Let it dry and then we can reevaluate it. Let's go ahead and get a little bit, let's see what happens when we actually mix yellow ochre and Viridian. Wow, so the yellow ochre, this pigment is just way stronger than the Viridian. The Viridian doesn't, I mean, I'm adding a bunch of Viridian in here. It's just not making a huge impact on this yellow ochre. So the yellow ochre is just a lot, it's a much stronger pigment than the Viridian, it seems. If this was like a phthalo green, it would, I suspect it would be the opposite, because phthalos tend to be extremely strong. That's better, I think. Getting a little bit more of that sunlight hitting the grass color. And if I have to put any water on my brush, I just kind of dip the corner in there so I don't get too much water. You can see how much lighter this is. It seems to dry a lot darker, actually. I definitely made that beak way too big, so let's just go ahead and kind of revise that right now. So also with the, I think that, you know, now that I've thought about it a little bit, I think that the Payne's gray, because it's so much stronger than the Viridian, it's kind of overwhelming the Viridian in the shadow area. So now I think I can probably just add some Viridian to that mix. Get it a little bit closer to what I want. And maybe we actually need, let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and try some yellow ochre in here too, maybe. I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not, but we'll see. Can leave some of that really dark color showing through at least. And we'll get some of these darker spots up here. Just kind of scumble them in. All right, so I'm gonna just let the grass alone for a little bit and we'll work on the duck. Another nice thing about gouache is that you can work either from dark to light values or you can work from light to dark values. You can go either way. So for me, like if I'm doing a color study for what I would like to eventually be an oil painting, I will work from dark to light. But if I'm out plein air painting and, you know, time is of the essence and I don't have, you know, as much time to plan everything out in terms of which values to lay down first, gouache is really nice because you don't necessarily have to do it in any particular order. Like with watercolor, you really do have to work from your light values up to your dark values, and oil paintings, you really need to try to work from your dark values to your light values. With gouache, it doesn't matter nearly as much, which is really kind of liberating. I'm going to go ahead and start with this kind of neutral mix right here. I'm going to be looking for some of the shadow areas, which are kind of greenish, but I'll neutralize that a little bit with just a touch of burnt sienna here. And this is nice and transparent, so I can just kind of experiment a little bit before committing to anything, because this seems maybe a little bit too dark actually. I don't like to go into my white too early, just like with oil painting. Try as much as I can to add whites later. And we're going to bring out some of this green just a little bit more down here. And if I go a little bit overboard on my shadows, on my darks, no big deal, because I can just come back with more opaque mixes that have white, and it shouldn't be an issue. I think I need to warm it up just a little bit with yellow ochre, especially up here. And I'll lighten this up. I know it's too dark right now, but it'll give me kind of a nice chromatic undertone to work on top of. And I really like how in my photo, a lot of the duck is kind of in shadow. It'll still be lighter than it is right now, but then the head is really catching a little bit of sunlight, and so it's very nice and light and illuminated. So even though I haven't made a video in a long time, it's not that I haven't tried. I as I said, I got some new equipment, including a brand new camera, which is a much better camera than my phone, which is all I had before. But I was really frustrated at first because I'd be recording and painting along, happy as could be, and then all of a sudden I would look up and my camera wasn't recording anymore. It would just stop and it wouldn't even beep or anything to tell me that it was not recording, so I had to really mess with the settings. With my phone, I never had the issue. It would just record forever and ever. And I mean, unless I ran out of battery or something. So that was kind of frustrating. And I don't even remember what I did to fix it, but it's still going right now, so I'm happy. A little more yellow ochre. Every time I dip into the yellow ochre, I get a lot more than I necessarily wanted. This seems about right. We'll see what it looks like when it starts drying. It'll kind of, I'm sure it'll absorb in a little bit and not be quite this light, but we're getting there. That's another thing, you know, as I paint with different mediums, I notice, you know, for example, oil paint tends to not change in color or value as it dries. So you kind of, it's like what you see is what you get while you're painting. But with both watercolor and gouache, that's not necessarily the case. So sometimes it, you know, dries. I think with gouache it tends to be a little bit more like acrylic paint where it dries a little bit darker than it appears when you're initially applying the paint, and then with watercolor it tends to lighten up as it dries. I'm sure there's a good scientific explanation for that, and I'll bet one person I love to go to when I have questions about this kind of stuff is James Gurney. He just knows everything. I'm sure he has a video on why that occurs. And he also tends to paint in different mediums too, so a lot of times I'll find answers not just, you know, on watercolor or gouache, which is what most of his videos relate to, but sometimes I'll find out information about oil paint too, because he does do some oil paint as well. I have a bunch of his books too, so he's just a really great resource. I'm going to go ahead and just cover up the eye. Sometimes when I sketch, it's not necessarily because I need the sketch, but it's almost more like a warm-up for me. So if I have to cover up some features and then repaint them later, it's okay. And I think I'll do all right just sticking with this brush for this sketch. And that's a good thing to practice even when you're just, you know, at home in the comfort of like your studio or wherever you like to work. Practice painting with one brush, because I know like if I'm going out plein air painting, I don't like to switch brushes. I'll bring all my brushes out there, but there's so much going on and I want to focus so much just on the painting itself that having to think about switching brushes to accomplish different things, I find is kind of wasted time, wasted energy. I just want to paint. So it's a really great strength to just be able to learn how to maneuver one brush. And to get that really nice painterly look, I think it's great to use a brush that maybe is just a little bit too big, something bigger than what you feel comfortable with. You're going to get more of those like painterly brush strokes if you do it that way. So I'm just adding more and more white to this mix. There's still just a little bit of yellow ochre to kind of warm it up a little bit. But I'm just adding some splashes of white as I go to kind of lighten up the values. And then I want to do some scumbling. So what I'll do is I'll take my paper towel, just kind of rub off a little bit of that excess pigment, and then I'll just kind of do a little bit of scumbling here to get texture, a little bit of light over these darker grays without lightening them too much. And that, I think, kind of helps soften things up a little bit too. So overall, let's see, kind of squinting so I can judge my values. I feel like these grays in here, I don't know, not too bad, I guess. I mean, given that I'm using a very limited, I probably maybe would add a little bit of blue. I guess I could use Payne's gray. Let's just see what happens. Because I added a lot of yellow up here, but I don't feel like there's enough contrast with the shadow areas in terms of temperature. So I kind of want to cool those down a little bit maybe. And I think that we'll see when it dries. I'll be able to judge it a little bit better, but I do think this is helping to kind of create a little bit of contrast in temperature. And you know, I kind of neglected this area where there's some reflected light from the grass, and I think I'll go back in here and see if I can brighten up these greens a little bit too. And I do see an opportunity to add a little detail. A little bit more Payne's gray. Actually, this should probably be green too. Let's green this up a little bit. I hope that my mixing isn't too chaotic. So I just added some more Viridian into this kind of yellow ochre mixture over here, so I can try to bring out the greens under here a little bit more. And I think just get a little bit more Viridian. Yeah, that's better, I think. Just kind of push those greens a little bit, exaggerate them a bit. I just think that helps overall. Oh my goodness, that yellow ochre is so strong. It's just like taking over. I really wanted this to be mostly white here with just a touch of warmth from the yellow ochre. And it's just taking over. Get a little of that gray mixed in here too. There we go. I'm just kind of judging things by squinting again. To judge my values. Let's give that a rest and just move on to the beak. I haven't used that Quinacridone Violet at all. Don't know. Trying to just think of like a way to sneak it in, but I'm not sure it's gonna. I mean, I guess I could try to make an orange with this and the yellow ochre. Let's just see. That works pretty well, actually. This is a little bit much for the beak, but maybe as an undertone it'll look okay. Then we'll go over it with a little more yellow ochre. Again, I'm just maneuvering this brush. This brush is a little big for the beak area, but I'm just trying to maneuver it as best I can to make it work. All right, so that's a nice undertone for the beak. Maybe we can also use, I mean, the eye is so small, but we can use a little bit of the Quinacridone Violet and a little bit of the Payne's Gray to make a nice dark dab of color for the eye. I think ducks tend to have kind of reddish eyes if you look at them closely. I'm just going to use the very corner of the brush just to dab in an eye there. That helps. Helps kind of bring things together a bit. And I think maybe for this grass, maybe I should actually add a little bit of white to lighten it up, add a little more contrast up there eventually. So let's let the beak dry a little bit, and now let's go ahead and look at that grass. So I have like yellow ochre and white right here, so I'm just going to add a little bit of green. We'll see if we can get a nice sunny contrast up there. A little bit of texture. try not to add white if I don't absolutely need it. And a lot of times yellow, because it has a lighter local value, will be enough to lighten a color without using white. So that's always kind of the way I try to go initially. But in this case, I think that a little bit of white could be a little helpful. Alright, I think that was pretty helpful actually. Just a little bit more green down here. Again, I just want to kind of push that a little bit, exaggerate it. And now let's finish the beak, and I think we're pretty much done. My water's pretty dirty, so it's getting more and more difficult to get all the pigment out of the bristles. So let's try just some yellow ochre here. And see if that gives us enough. Well, it seems like it's kind of being absorbed right into that other mix. Maybe I have too much water in these bristles. There we go. It's not bad. So I was able to use that Quinacridone Violet a little bit. It's subtle. It's all right. Just want to scumble over some of this grass with Payne's gray. Soften this edge a little bit too. I think I kind of lost the form right there a little bit. Doesn't bother me too much though. And then the very, very, very last thing I'm going to do is just add the nostril onto the bill. And that, I think, you know what, I'll just use a little bit of Quinacridone Violet, because it doesn't need to be as dark as the eye. There. Now I feel like I legitimately used this limited palette to the fullest extent that I could, except I don't think I might have used my burnt sienna once, but you know, not too bad. Fun little sketch, and gouache is fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you think. And let me know if you want to see more gouache sketch videos and if this was helpful for you. Another thing that I usually don't do that I tried to get myself to do in this video is actually record my voice as I paint. Another hang up that I have, kind of going back to the whole dogs barking in the background thing, is that I tended to not want to have to deal with like editing out my barking dogs, and so I would just record a video and then I would mute it so you wouldn't hear my dogs barking in the background, and then I would do a voiceover, but that's very time consuming. And also I recently got a full-time job, which I love and I'm very thankful for, but that has really limited the amount of time I can devote to making videos. And so having to do voiceovers basically means I spend however long painting, and then I spend an equal amount of time again going over that and explaining what I'm doing. And usually to do my voiceovers, I either have to wait until late at night when my dogs are asleep, or I have to go sit out in my car to do it. And so you can probably imagine that that makes difficult to find time to do videos. So let me know what you guys think of my narration style as I try to both navigate the painting process and explaining it simultaneously. It's kind of a challenge, but I would really like to get a little bit of feedback if you were able to stick with me this whole time. And let me know what you think, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.